Hello, and welcome to this latest episode of the Driving Net Profit with Zero Emissions podcast. I am Barbara Albert, co-CEO of 100% Renewables, a consultancy specializing in the development of net zero strategies. Today we're speaking with Simon Holmes. Simon was born into one of Australia's most prominent families, but for many years he kept his passions out of the public eye. This changed when he attended a community group meeting in central Victoria in May 2007, which led him to play a leading role in developing Australia's first community-owned wind farm group, the award-winning Hepburn Community Wind Park. This experience propelled Simon into the intersection of politics, community activism, and climate action, where he's been ever since. Over the years, Simon has worked in various roles, including as an energy analyst, clean tech investor, climate philanthropist, and director of the Smart Energy Council and the Australian Environmental Grantmakers Network. He has co-founded the Australian Wind Alliance and was the inaugural chair of the Melbourne Energy Institute's advisory board, and is often sought after as a commentator on the economic and political aspects of Australia's energy transition. In 2019, Simon founded Climate 200, an initiative aimed at empowering communities to nurture their own political candidates and effect change on climate issues. The initiative played a significant role in shaking things up during the 2022 federal election, establishing Simon as a major force in Australian politics. In 2022, Simon's book, The Big Teal, was published. Hi, Simon, and welcome to the Driving a Profit with Zero Emissions show.
Thanks, Barbara. Thanks for having me on the show.
Simon, you and I recently participated in a panel discussion in the Queensland Performing Arts Centre where friend Kelly asked the opening question of whether we think that net zero by 2050 is achievable. I'd like to start off our discussion with a similar question. Do you think that we can bend our emissions curve sufficiently to limit climate change to 1.5 degrees?
Sure. Yeah, Barbara, I'm absolutely confident that we can. The vast majority of our emissions come from our energy sector, and the pathway to decarbonising is actually pretty straightforward. It's to electrify everything, and then to clean up our electricity. So basically, to move towards renewables. That second bit, we're already moving towards renewables at quite a pace. I often point out that a dozen years ago, Australia was at about 9% renewables. We're now at 36, and in a dozen years from now, we're expected to be well above 90. So electricity sector is already in a very significant decarbonisation. That leaves the rest, the rest of the economy. Now, many of our appliances at home are already electric, but there's a huge fleet in Australia of gas hot water heaters, of gas space heaters, and of course all the cars that we drive, or most of them at the moment, are petrol powered. And we'll see over the next 10 to 20 years a very significant conversion of that fleet across to electric as EVs start to dominate sales. So we already have 80% of the 80% of our emissions can be taken care of with existing technologies, and we have a pretty good idea what technologies will be used to decarbonize the remainder.
Yeah, absolutely. It almost seems like the next frontier. Electricity emissions are kind of easy to take care of, the scope 2 emissions for businesses, but the scope 1 frontier has yet to be tackled, right? So transitioning fleet away from petrol and diesel to electric, for instance, or changing natural gas consumption for industry is really tricky, that scope 1 frontier.
Obviously, it depends on the industry. For a lot of businesses, most of their energy use is already electricity. But for more industrial firms, some of them it will be fairly significant changes for them to decarbonize.
So who do you think should do the most work to get to net zero? Should it be businesses, or should it be government? Should it be big finance, or should it be the community?
In general, I think what works best in our society, in our economy, is when government sets the rules, and so that businesses know what the playing field looks like, but are given the time and assistance in the more difficult sectors to transition. But really, a partnership between government getting the regulations and rules right, and assistance programs, but businesses being able to make investment decisions as plant needs to be replaced, as new investments are made, that they'll be investing in the decarbonised solutions rather than reinvesting in capital that will have another 20 or 30 years of life associated with emissions. We need to make sure that people's next investment decision, every decision they make from now on, that the attractive thing to do is, and the profitable thing to do, frankly, is to make the decision that moves us in the direction of decarbonisation.
Because that's certainly where the world is going. It's almost like a risk-based decision. Why would you invest capex into something that's not going to be there in future? And it's also thinking about not replacing like for like, but thinking about decarbonized solutions. So, what does a net zero world look like for someone like you? How do you envisage our future?
I got to say, I'm probably a lot less sensationalist than others. I think if we do this transition well, and I think we will, that most of us won't actually notice. That for most, certainly for most of us, as we get about our day, we wake up in the morning and we have a shower. That'll be with water that was heated with a heat pump rather than with gas. We'll have our breakfast. If it's toast, it will be made. The toaster will be just the same as the toaster you have now, but the electricity will be 100% renewable, rather than as I said, 12 years ago maybe only 9%. Now more than a third. Soon it'll be well above 90%. So and then getting to work, it'll be either on a train that'll be electrified, if it's not already, but the electricity will be clean, or in a car that's using electrons rather than petrol to get you from A to B. You'll get to work, and the office equipment, or if you're in industrial environment, many of the services that might be powered by gas right now will be powered by electricity. So if we do this transition right, very little will actually be noticeable to the end user or the average worker. We will be making investment decisions to buy the piece of equipment that is associated with zero emissions, rather than the piece that right now relies on burning fossil fuels to operate. So I don't actually think it's that it will have anywhere near the impact of so many innovations that we've had over. So the amount of change over the last century has been absolutely phenomenal in our society, and these changes happen at a reasonable pace, and when not managed can be dislocating to some. But net zero, I think the vast majority of Australians will not actually be impacted in any negative way. If anything, they'll enjoy cleaner air, quieter streets, better cars. We should be looking at this all as opportunity, not as something to be afraid of.
That's great. So that means you're arguing for the fact that if governments and businesses take the right decisions and make the right investment choices, set up the correct infrastructure, have the correct policy settings, then the average Australian won't even notice.
Yeah, I think that's fair enough. We need to get to the position where when your gas hot water heater has an issue and needs to be replaced, that the easiest decision is to replace it with a heat pump.
Not according to my plumber.
Yeah, exactly. So we need to get to that position, and right now, a lot of those purchasing decisions are not made with an eye to long-term cost. They're made with an eye to the convenience of the installer or the habit of the installer.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the role. I think that's the role for government to look at what are the factors that influence the plumber's recommendation to you, or when you build a house, how do we make sure that it's heated with a reverse cycle air conditioner rather than heated with gas ducted heating, as some houses or many houses down here in Melbourne would be. So how do we make them the appliance of choice? And of course, in the vehicle space, how do we rapidly get to the point where electric vehicles are the vehicles of choice for new car buyers, and we start seeing them in a small number of years being readily available in the second-hand market as well?
Definitely. So, what opportunities do you see in terms of job creation and economic growth in different industries?
Yeah, well, Australia's in a really, really fortunate position. We talk a lot about our national anthem, and our poetry talks about boundless plains and sunburnt country, and these boundless plains are absolutely drenched in sun, and they're windswept, some of the world's best winds here, and we have a very large amount of space per capita in this country. We have an advanced economy, access to good finance, and a capable workforce that puts us in the pole position to generating some of the lowest cost energy in the world. And then we're blessed with the mineral resources. Australia's been famous for exploiting its mineral resources for many decades, but not famous for adding value to them. We ship, one thing I think few Australians are aware of is that more than half the world's lithium driving around in all the electric vehicles and batteries in your phones and laptop, more than half the world's lithium is coming from Australia. But we only capture about 1% of the value chain for that lithium. The processing is largely done overseas, and the turning it into battery cells and battery packs is largely done overseas. In a smarter Australia that takes advantage of its low cost energy and the difficulty of moving energy in around the world. And it's not just the minerals we're famous for being iron ore, say bauxite that gets turned into aluminium, but Australia has very good reserves of many of the critical minerals for the coming for the decarbonisation we're in, whether that's the rare earth materials, cobalt, nickel, and lithium. As I mentioned, we have an embarrassment of riches of resources and access to the low cost energy to transform those into high value goods.
Would see these opportunities, and for us to have the right policy settings in place to enable innovation, entrepreneurship, and for companies to seize the opportunity. But unfortunately, Australia's climate policies of the past decade have been horrible. They've been widely criticized both domestically and internationally. In your opinion, what were some of the biggest missed opportunities for climate action during this period?
Well, we had to go slow on renewable energy. I mean, we did have a renewable energy target that, to credit, was brought in by the Howard government back in 2001, was legislated, and we had bipartisanship on renewable energy and an industry that was really moving fast. But that bipartisanship splintered around about, or shattered, I should say, around about 2012, and the federal government worked quite hard to frustrate the development of the renewable energy sector. Despite that, a lot has been done. We've sort of seen the industry grow, but not as fast as it would be. But we've done very little on preparing for these decarbonising industries. For instance, in Austria and Sweden, there are pilot plants that are turning iron ore into green steel. This is some methods to make steel without using any coal. these projects are scaling up, but at this point in time, we don't have any pilot plants in Australia. I visited a facility in Belgium back in 2019, facility in Belgium that at a cement works that was producing cement with and being able to capture all of the carbon, so it wasn't being vented into the atmosphere. This technology, though, was developed in Australia, developed not far from where I am in Melbourne, by an Australian company, but couldn't get support to commercialise it in Australia, and it was lured to the.
Happened.
Yeah, we've seen it again and again. This company was lured to Europe by the carbon price and a technology development fund. Two things that we briefly had, and our carbon price was torn down in 2014, and our decarbonising research R&D funds had billions removed from them. So we've seen a lot of Australian innovation once again leak overseas, and I'm hoping that there are signs, certainly positioning from the new federal, I guess we can still call it new, only just federal government, which does appear to understand that global decarbonisation is an opportunity, not a threat to Australia.
Yeah, thank goodness. We are recording now this podcast on the 10th of May, and just yesterday the federal budget was announced, which contains around $6.6 billion in funding for key initiatives like $2 billion for the Hydrogen Head Start program, $3 billion in cost relief for homes and SMEs under the Energy Price Relief Plan, and $1.6 billion for the Energy Savings Plan, which will kickstart electrification and help homes and businesses switch to clean energy. What are your initial thoughts on the budget, Simon, and how can it help Australia transition towards net zero emissions?
Well, it's good to see the words climate and energy transition in a federal budget. So hats off for recognition. There is a clear difference between this government and the last on how it approaches these issues. But I would say it is a fairly timid budget in regards. And the Hydrogen Head Start $2 billion program, I'm not sure hydrogen is actually the next biggest priority. I think there are other priorities, such as accelerating the rollout of renewables, so we hit the government's fairly aggressive targets, and storage. There is mention in the budget of the new capacity investment mechanism, which is a scheme to bring more storage in the market, but there's no detail around it. The Hydrogen Head Start program, there's not a lot of detail, and almost all the money that is allocated to it is past the forward estimates, being the next 4 years. So there's very little in that $2 billion that we'll see anytime soon. So no gold star there. But on the energy relief, I mean, it will be a relief to a number of to millions of households to get the discount against this year's electricity bills, and that will defray a significant amount of the recent electricity price hikes, which are a result largely of increasing coal and gas prices due to Putin's invasion of Ukraine. But it's a one-off sugar hit. Unfortunately, the households will still be faced with high prices next year, and hopefully prices start coming down. But this one-off hit doesn't really help businesses and households in the long term. So I think it would have been preferable to invest that money in getting people's electricity costs down. So helping people move to more efficient appliances, helping people install solar if they don't already have it. I'm not sure they got the balance right there. There is $1 billion for effectively for green loans to make it easier for people to borrow money for home retrofits. So moving to more efficient heating, water and space heating, electric vehicles, double glazing of windows. There's $1 billion in money for green loans there. It'll make some difference, but Saul Griffith, who's been making a lot of noise about this exact space of home electrification, his calculations were to meet the equivalent of what the US has done would have taken 13 billion. So the 1 billion the government has allocated in this area over the forward estimates is only a drop in the ocean. So some good themes, but not very brave, and not really going to move the needle a bit. We would have liked to have seen a lot more.
Yeah, more ambitious action. And for our listeners who are interested in finding out more about Saul Griffith, I interviewed him in episode 8, I think, of this podcast. And you can find out more about his theories on electrification and making everything renewable. Now, I want to switch gears for a bit and talk about your origin story. We recently talked about the fact that we both actually come from a background in IT. My defining moment when I changed tack and left my successful career in IT behind to work at the intersection of climate action and business was shortly before I had my second child. I felt really strongly that I needed to use my skills and my experience to help solve this massive problem of climate change so that my children could experience this same beautiful world that I hold so dearly. What's your origin story, Simon? How did you become so passionate about climate action?
Oh, well, I grew up in Western Australia, and we spent a lot of time down in the forests. So the southwest of Western Australia is some of the most amazing. Well, it's an area of Australia that really touches me deeply. But as I was growing up and experiencing this, it was also an area that was being hit hard by logging. It was being the forests were being exploited for timber. Much of it, unfortunately, ends up as wood chips. So I became really aware of the tension between nature and the exploitation of nature at an early stage, but also became I've always had an engineering mindset and been fascinated by energy, and when I was first exposed to renewable energy about nearly 20 years ago, when we built a house off grid. It's too far to bring in power lines, and it was cheaper to put in solar even back then. I started to understand the role of renewable energy in protecting the environment. So these threads definitely came together and moved forward a lot with a community wind farm project that I got involved with in central Victoria, which was the intersection of community, climate concern, and energy development, and bringing the community together for a shared goal of building a piece of infrastructure that was going to help us dramatically reduce our community's carbon footprint.
Yeah, and your background story is described so extremely well in your book, The Big Teal, which I can highly recommend. It was a riveting read. I loved reading it. Personally, I'm a bit disillusioned by politics, I have to admit. I've witnessed that there was practically no action on climate over the last 10 years, but I'm a big fan of the Teal's independence movement. They stand for climate action, integrity, and gender equity. So you released the book got published, I think, at the end of 2022, so last year. Can you
Correct.
share
Yeah.
the story of Climate 200 and the story of how the book happened? What inspired you to write the book?
Yeah, so Climate 200 is one part of the community independence movement. Now, the community independence movement and Climate 200 played a significant role in the last federal election and created a fair bit of discomfort for the then government. So we were subject to a lot of misinformation about us, and a lot of confusion about Climate 200 in the media. So with a couple of months after the election, with bit of the perspective that comes from a little bit of time, but close enough that it was still very fresh. I thought it'd be a good time to sit down and write the origins of how Climate 200 came together and what our role is in the community independence movement. So independents are not new in Australian politics. There haven't been a lot, something like 15 or so from World War II through till about 2010. But there's been that many since. So it's a significant increase. But most of the independents that have before now have been someone who's left the party or someone who had a very high profile in their community. What's new about this movement? And this movement, it looked to many like an overnight success, but really goes back to about 2012, when a group of people in the Northern Victorian seat of Indi got together, frustrated that their community had been neglected, was taken for granted for so long. The community had no, the public transport system was broken. They didn't have a local hospital with any significant services, very few education opportunities, and they just saw a massive brain drain of young people leaving the area, going to Melbourne and never coming back. And they saw that if they didn't manage to get services, their fair share of services to this community, they were going to continually see the young people disappear. So they were determined to turn the seat marginal so that the seat wouldn't be taken for granted. They went and the group went and looked for the best person they could to represent them at election. They tapped Cathy McGowan on the shoulder, and she agreed reluctantly at first to run, thinking there was no chance she was going to win. And she accidentally won, she would say. But they and was re-elected that was the 2013 election. She was re-elected in 2016, and in 2019 she had decided to retire, and the community selected Helen Haynes to replace her, and she was elected and just had a second. She was just re-elected in 2022. So that community has had now 4 elections in a row. They've chosen a community independent. We saw Zali Steggall, her community selected her back in 2019, and she beat out the previous Prime Minister, Tony Abbott. And we saw a number of communities put a toe in the water and try back in 2019. A lot of them got a foothold, from which they turned that into a win in 2022. So this community independence movement has been bubbling away for more than a decade in Australia. This model where communities come together, they're generally, these groups are from the centre in their community, people who don't feel a strong allegiance to any party. They just want good local representation. They'd prefer to have an independent than a party member. And we saw at the federal election, there were 4 community independents already in Parliament, and we saw another 6 elected into the lower house, and 1 in David Pocock in the Senate. Climate 200's role, we were a crowdfunding campaign. We raised about $13 million from over 11,000 people, and the money was used to help accelerate the campaigns. Unfortunately, it costs money in our democracy and to run election campaigns. The major parties have massive cash reserves and receive massive public subsidies for their parties, whereas independents, challengers don't receive anything from the government. So our role was to help them level the playing field so that they could compete. So the book is really a description of how I came to be involved, what the movement is, Climate 200's role, what actually happened during the election, and some ideas for where to from here for Australian politics. But it's a relatively short book. One journalist told me it's mercifully short. So it's think of it more like an essay than a book.
I'm hoping you're going to write another, because you're a really good writer. So, Simon, can you share with us some of the biggest successes that Climate 200 has achieved to date, and how have these successes impacted the broader effort to combat climate change in Australia?
Well, we're really proud of the communities that we supported. The last federal election, there are about 35 communities that worked hard to get an independent elected. We supported 23 of them, and all up, 11 made it through to Parliament, with maybe 5 or 6 that came close. And a lot of communities now can see that this is a viable model for them. I think what's most exciting is we now have there's a record size crossbench. The crossbench being those who sit between the two parties. And there is now a clear majority in Parliament of MPs that support climate action and the decarbonisation of Australia's economy. And those independents consistently hold the government to account and push them further in this regard, and help to make it very clear that there is a strong mandate for more action in Australia. So we're proud to have engaged so many Australians to support so many great communities for such great success.
Indeed. So in Brisbane, you mentioned to me that $1 invested in the right candidate has a much bigger effect than investing in alternative climate solutions, that it has a huge multiplication effect. Can you elaborate on that or explain it to me a bit better?
Yeah, I think we're talking about a journal paper that I'd read recently that was making the claim that for action on or for action on climate change, or for reducing carbon from an economy, the most effective thing you can do is to support the politics rather than, say, going out and buying carbon credits. Clearly for businesses investing in climate solutions for their own business can have a very high return on investment. But for the average person, one of the most impactful things we can do, if you're passionate in this area, is to support politics. That it's really striking at the root of what needs to be done to make sure that the decision makers, people who are every day of the week working on the policies that are going to drive this transformation, if we don't have the right people working at the root, working in favour of this, then we can all be wasting so much of our time. So I think it really is the most effective thing we can do to support these pro-climate independents. I think that can be demonstrated, the effectiveness of that, from what we've seen in the shift in Australian politics just in the last 12 months.
In your book, there is a section called Call Me Trimtab, and this is where you talk about the fact that we have to strike at the root. I've thought so much about this because, in my role, co-leading a consultancy, I always ask myself the question, am I affecting, or how can I affect the biggest change and work really efficiently and effectively? And you talk about the fact that you have to strike at the root rather than working on the
Hacking
branches.
at the branches.
Can you elaborate on that? I
Well,
really liked
let me tell you.
this comparison.
Yeah, this trim tab analogy. I take this from Buckminster Fuller. But he was an American engineer, mid 20th century. So he was a household name back then. He's faded in the public consciousness since, but a very innovative thinker. And he was one of the first to describe circular economy. That it is in our interest to make sure that products go through a life cycle, and their final part of their life cycle is recycling into new products, and that efficiency is good for the economy and good for the planet. He was one of the first to describe this, but he he talked a lot about trim tabs, and he was he had a nautical engineering background, and in this case he was referring to, well, the example he gave was the Queen Mary, which at that stage was the largest ocean liner, passenger liner, which was larger than the Titanic had been, and at the end of this ship, which was half a mile long ship, was and I'm going to use imperial measurements because he did. There was a 12-foot rudder at the very end, and when the ship is powering along, the currents of water either side of that rudder make it very difficult for it to turn. But at the very tip of the rudder is a device, a trim tab, a small strip only about 6 inches long that can be turned. And when that strip turns, it creates a low pressure region that helps pull the rudder around, and gradually the ship starts to turn around, and over the next half hour can turn a full 180 degrees. So you've got that one tiny little bit at the end of the ship that, when moved the right amount at the right time, can move the whole ship of state around. He called himself a trim tab, that he would look for the opportunity to be at the right place at the right time, and with a small change, create a medium-sized change that ended up moving the massive ship around. And he liked this phrase "trim tab" so much that on his own tombstone, all it says is "Call me trim tab." He would try to find how he could be a trim tab in society. Very much, I've found that very inspirational, and I'd like to think that Climate 200, which is not just me, but 11,000 Australians helping communities around the country, I'd like to think that Climate 200 is a trim tab.
One of the things you mention in your book is the good bloke advantage, and that many talented Australians, particularly women, won't go near politics, leaving us with a preponderance of career politicians who started in university politics and rose through the ranks without ever holding down a job in the real world. And you mentioned that the crossbench, as you said before, could be an attractive pathway for successful politicians to serve the communities and their country. There is no female equivalent of the good bloke advantage, and I was intrigued by that. What is the good bloke advantage, and how can women win?
Yeah, I found this fascinating when Cathy McGowan, that first MP from the first independent from Indi, is from a big family. She has 3 brothers and 9 sisters. One of those sisters, Ruth McGowan, spends most of her life helping people, mostly women, understand, who are interested in politics, helps them to train them for the confidence to get involved, and some of the skills to get involved in politics. And when I first met her, she talked about how we often hear that about certain politicians, that people will say, "Oh, look, I don't agree with Barnaby on everything he says, but he means he means well, or he means what he says, or if you get to meet him, he's actually a good bloke." And she said, she talked about this. Men have this good bloke advantage. They can be rubbish politicians. They can have horrible views, but you meet them in the public setting, or we meet them at the pub, and people form the impression quickly that they're, whatever all their faults are, they're a good bloke, and they get votes, significant number of votes for this. And she asked me, well, men have this good bloke advantage. What advantage to women? What's the equivalent advantage for women? And I thought for a while, and she stopped me after about 10 seconds and said, I've been in this game for 20 years. There is no good bloke advantage for women. There is no equivalent. That it's a unique part of a unique advantage that men have in our society, that they can be rubbish people, but socially fun, and they can glide through, and that women don't get the same break. is Ruth's theory, and I think there's a lot of truth in that. And I think other people I've met in the movement have helped me understand. When you go around and meet people who are involved in these community independence campaigns, the people doing the work are overwhelmingly women, and the candidates they pick are overwhelmingly women. Not universally. There are some great men. Andrew Wilkie, David Pocock, and then candidates who came close to winning at the federal election, Alex Dyson and Rob Priestley. So, and then we've had Tony Windsor and Rob Oakeshott before. So there are definitely great men in independent politics, but overwhelmingly the interest and the candidates are women in this movement. And I'm fascinated by that, and I've asked quite a few people why that is, and probably one of the strongest, clearest messages I got back was actually a woman who's worked with Cathy McGowan for much of the last dozen years in this movement, Alana Johnson, who makes the point that the parties are very patriarchal systems. They run very much like they did 100 years ago, and they're a boys' club. Women can succeed in them, but they have to. It's a hostile environment for them, and they have to adopt the sort of survival skills and tactics and career advancement skills in this very in this sort of dated environment that is far removed from the improvements we've seen in the workplace elsewhere in society. But for a lot of accomplished women just aren't prepared to play that game, to be part of that, as Alana would put it, to make the patriarchal bargain, the bargain that I'll play like a boy in order to, I'll play like a man in order to rise up through the male ranks. Whereas this independence movement, there are a lot fewer egos in the structures that in these community groups that find candidates and help them get elected. I've heard women say that the way of these campaigns are much more compatible with women's way of working, much more collaborative. And these roles, what we see, the independents who are working on the crossbench, much more appealing for talented women to get involved with, who have just had no interest in being part of politics as usual. So I think it's a fascinating moment in Australian politics where we've seen a very significant increase in the number of women in Parliament, partly because there's been this new pathway into Parliament that avoids a very dated system.
Absolutely. We need more women with integrity, which Climate 200 stands for in Parliament, but also more women on boards, more women in leadership positions. So looking ahead, what are Climate 200's plans for the future? And how do you see the movement evolve over the coming years to continue to support climate action in Australia?
Well, we're approached by communities all the time who are interested in what they see has happened in other communities, and a group that Cathy McGowan helped start, called the Community Independence Project, ran a conference last August training communities in how they could run community campaigns, and people from 100 different electorates turned up. There are 151 electorates in the country, but I'd expect that there will be more. There will be more communities that give it a crack at the next federal election. There were more that gave it a go at the state elections recently, and local government elections come up. I think it is that there is a renewed interest in independence, and Climate 200 will keep our doors open and keep our focus on helping to level the playing field so that communities can have a red hot go at having genuine local representation in our democracy, rather than it being completely sewn up by just two major parties. So we exist to help level the playing field so that communities can do what we've seen so many do so recently.
So, shifting gears just a little bit, focusing now on businesses, because we talked a lot about how individuals and the community can support the Teals movement and Climate 200. But how can businesses support, or businesses that are looking to engage with government on climate issues, be best practices for effective collaboration and advocacy? Because I often think about the fact that all businesses have a carbon footprint, but every business also has a policy footprint. There is an advocacy role. Businesses can influence politics. So, what are some of the best practices for effective collaboration and advocacy that businesses can pursue or should
Yeah,
pursue?
I really like your the concept of a policy footprint. I'm going to think more about that. Thanks for that, Barbara. Well, I think it's important for businesses to recognise that they do have a voice in our democracy. Clearly, not a vote, but our governments of all stripes recognise the legitimacy of that the business needs to operate well in order for us to have a strong economy and all thrive. I think it's important businesses are part of industry associations that are advocating on their behalf, and when those some of those industry groups in Australia have played very positive roles, and some have at times played really negative roles. It's good to see some larger businesses have told lobby groups like the Business Council of Australia to get their act together, and the Business Council of Australia has moved from being a negative force to a positive force on climate in recent years. There are companies that put pressure on the Minerals Council to be to stop playing a wrecking force. That's had made some improvements there. So I think businesses recognizing that they collectively have a powerful voice, and making sure that voice is used for good. But I think as businesses understand the challenges that they have in moving towards net zero, they should make sure that their local members of parliament understand what are the barriers to decarbonisation. What does effective policy look like? The government, in its electricity bill relief, extended that to small businesses. So they're listening to the challenges that small businesses are playing. But there's a bunch of money in the budget for businesses to invest, or there are schemes where businesses can get tax deductions for investing in decarbonising or technologies that help them decarbonise. So I think it's important to have the dialogue with members and as individuals, for us to engage in democracy, to not think that democracy is what someone else does, or it's a particular class of our society that involves in democracy. We've shown that people can get involved, and it matters when people do. So
it absolutely matters. What would be your closing remarks and recommendations for pretty much every one of us? How can we support climate action? How can the community support you and Climate 200 and the Teals? What should we do?
Well, if you find yourself living or working in an electorate where that has been taken for granted, this model that was developed up in Indi more than a decade ago shows that by turning seats marginal, people can get people get noticed, communities get noticed, and communities can have a real voice in our in our democracy. So if you're in a community that you feel has been taken for granted, and I think frankly most communities are, the major parties only fight over about 30 of the seats of 151 seats in each election. Most seats, the parties have a tacit agreement between them on who, quote, owns those seats. Well, we don't need. We've shown at the last federal election that doesn't have to be the case. That by pushing a seat towards being marginal, the government and the opposition sit up and take notice. So, absolutely viable for communities to step in and stop their seats being taken for granted. But so join a group if there is one, start one if there isn't, and support community independence wherever you may find them. I think it's some of the most exciting things we can do for our democracy and for the decarbonisation challenge we have. There's a real window of hope that has opened up since the last federal election, and it's putting Australia in a really good position to seize the opportunities from the decarbonisation that's in front of us, to take advantage of Australia's the box seat role that we're going to have as the world continues to embrace this opportunity.
So before we end, I just wanted to ask you, if people want to buy the book, where can people get the book from?
So it's available at all good bookstores, but Booktopia, one of the and I believe Amazon have it, and it's available as in paperback, ebook, and there's an audio book as well. And it's, as I said before, it's a relatively quick read, it sets out how the movement came about and Climate 200's role within it. Bit of my story, and then where to from here for Australian politics and Climate 200.
Yeah, I can really recommend this book to our listeners. It's called The Big Teal by Simon Holmes. So how can people connect with you if they want to find out more?
I'm very active on Twitter, so you can find me there, and I'm pretty good at responding to requests. That's probably the best place to find me.
Thank you so much for your time, Simon. That was Simon Holmes, a respected climate action advocate, entrepreneur, and accomplished author, known for his tireless efforts toward driving positive change in energy and climate action. I highly recommend reading his book, The Big Teal. If you know another person who you think will enjoy this podcast, please let them know so that more people can hear about best practice stories of how organizations are moving to net zero emissions. Remember, to reach net zero emissions, aim high, always be curious, and act now. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next episode.